It's the question of the ages. How do you know if you're a YouTube knife nut or not? Well, I have a few possibilities. If you have more pocket knives than you have pockets, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you carry pocket knives in places other than your pockets, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you have more than 3 tools for sharpening knives, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever spent more than 5 minutes watching a man cut cardboard, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever spent more than 5 minutes watching a man open his mail, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever seen someone cut himself and said, "Don't cut yourself," in a bad Slovak accent, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever cut yourself and felt like you let Gavco down, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever seen Gavco cut himself and felt angry and betrayed, how dare he do that? You might be a YouTube knife nut. If you hear the phrase middle finger flick and don't immediately think of something kinky, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever practiced a middle finger flick, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know that batoning wood is not something kinky, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you can say bushcraft without snickering, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know that Chicago screws are not something politicians from Illinois put to you, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know that side-to-side play, up and down play, and early lockup are not positions from the Kama Sutra, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know that persistence, resilience, tenacious, and ambitious are not values, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know that a hinderer is not something that prevents you from reaching your goals, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you own things called Dragonfly, Ladybug, Delica, Squirt, and Squeak, and you're above the age of 5, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever recorded what's in your pants and uploaded it to the internet, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If a recording of what was in your pants ever got you more subscribers, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever written an angry comment because someone insulted what you had in your pants and he wasn't talking about your naughty bits, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever watched a man show you what's in his pants and thought, "Oh, I can't wait to get my hands on one of those," you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you look down on people who haven't been to Blade, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know what Blade is, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you have a Grail knife, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you call it a Grail knife and not that really fucking expensive knife I want to buy, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever used the excuse, "But dear, it's only prepping for a disaster," to justify repeated knife purchases, you might be a YouTube knife nut. And a very bad husband. If your favorite deer hunting show is made by a Japanese doctor who uses a shotgun, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you understand why a man who reviews chocolate, cigars, lighters, his garden, and hot sauce is called cutlery lover, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever accidentally or deliberately said "whoosh" as you've passed something to somebody, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you enjoy watching Nut and Fancy, but you don't want your other knife nut friends to know, you might be a YouTube knife nut. And a complete hypocrite. If you used to think that spending $100 for a knife was stupid and outrageous, but now, after watching too much Jim Skelton, you're beginning to think that $800 or $1,000 is reasonable for a well-made knife, you might be a YouTube knife nut. And you really need to hide your credit cards. If you've developed strong opinions about convex versus hollow versus flat grind, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know the difference between convex and hollow and flat grind, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've ever declared someone your sworn enemy because of his choice of grind, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you have long-running feuds with people you've never met, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you have long-running friendships with people you've never met, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you worry about something being shaving sharp, even if you never intend to shave with it, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you've exchanged gifts with people you've never met, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you know who Gus and Jeff are, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you think Gus is the real cutlery lover and Jeff is just his house elf, you might be a YouTube knife nut. Or maybe just nuts. If you think Gus is God, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If there are reviewers on YouTube you like better than members of your own family, and you'd really rather hang out with them, you might be a YouTube knife nut. If you think having 3 to 4 inches in your pants is more than adequate for everyday tasks, you might be a YouTube knife nut. But that's just my opinion. It might be mere blather.